acupuncture and acupressure, nipple stimulation, sometimes it's called breast stimulation, castor oil, date fruit, evening primrose oil, herbal treatments, pineapple, red raspberry leaf, sex, and walking. So those are the ones that I've personally looked at the research on. And I think the evidence is, comes on a spectrum. Like some of these are more supported by evidence than others.
You're listening to the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast, where you'll gain the tools, knowledge, and confidence you need to erase the unknowns, feel in control, and have an even better birth, no matter how you deliver. My name is Liesl Teen, mom of 2, practicing labor and delivery nurse, and your host. From over 8 years and counting of working at the bedside, I know that knowledge is the key to an even better birth. So tune in each week to learn about all things pregnancy, birth, and postpartum from me, a labor and delivery nurse that's seen it all. And now let's get into this week's episode. This week on the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast, I have a very special guest joining me, the incredible Rebecca Dekker from Evidence-Based Birth. Rebecca Dekker is a renowned expert in the field of evidence-based maternity care with a PhD in nursing. She's dedicated her life to being a full-time entrepreneur and patient advocate for evidence-based care. In this episode, we will be exploring the topic of natural labor induction and examining the evidence behind various methods. We'll be distinguishing between techniques that might actually put you into labor and start uterine contractions versus those that can gently encourage spontaneous labor over time, like, more cervical prep type methods. And of course, we'll talk about pros, cons, safety, and more. After this episode too, check out episode 77, Why It's Important to Prep Your Body for Labor. I'm so thrilled to have Rebecca here with me today. So let's dive in and explore the evidence behind natural labor induction techniques with the one and only Rebecca Dekker. Hi, Rebecca. Welcome to the Mommy Labor Nurse podcast. Thank you so much for being here today with me.
Hi, Liesl. I'm so excited to be here and talk with you.
Yeah. Okay, can you start by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, what you do, who are you, like the amazing lady that you are, because you are an amazing lady and you've done a lot of amazing things.
Thank you, Liesl. It's just so excited to be able to collaborate with you on this podcast and on mine. So I host the Evidence-Based Birth podcast, and I'm a nurse with my PhD, and I run Evidence-Based Birth. So it's a platform, a website where we publish the research on childbirth to make it publicly accessible. So things that used to be locked behind medical journals, and in many cases still are behind a paywall. We try to summarize everything so that if you have a question about something related to giving birth, hopefully we've covered it on our website and summarize all the research for you in a language that you can understand. So that's what we do. There's a whole team behind Evidence-Based Birth that is working on getting that research out there and serving our customers, about half of whom are birth workers and the other half are pregnant families. So that's kind of a little bit about what we do.
Love it. Yeah, I was going to ask, actually, I bet a big part of your audience who reads all of your stuff is people like me, like people who aren't pregnant, who just work in the birth industry.
Yeah, it's your life. It's your passion. If you're a doula or a labor and delivery nurse or a midwife. And one of the things that I think we have been able to help with is it makes the life of the birth worker, the professional, easier, because if your client has a question about something related to due dates or circumcision or water birth or whatever, you can just send them the link to whatever we've published on it. So it makes their jobs a lot easier.
Yeah, agreed. Because you guys have all of the sources at the end of your articles. It's not like, oh, hey, this is, something out here. It's like, no, I'm summarizing all of this stuff down here.
Yeah, we try to stay away from publishing just opinions. So that was something really early on that I was encouraged to do, was to try to take my bias out of it as much as possible. And, that's not 100% possible because there's bias in research. For example, how research is done and what kind of research is funded creates bias, but we do our best to try and explain the limitations of the research and to kind of summarize it in terms that you can understand and understand both the pros and the cons of the studies that we talk about. So, and then we always have a policy that we have the reference that goes along with what we're talking about. So.
Yeah, amazing. Well, we are going to be talking about natural labor inductions today. So let's just start off and talk about them in general and if there are any real evidence-based methods that truly work.
Okay. So I'm going to list the ones that I've looked at the research on. Does that sound okay with you?
Sounds great.
Okay. So acupuncture and acupressure, nipple stimulation, sometimes it's called breast stimulation, castor oil, date fruit, evening primrose oil, herbal treatments, pineapple, red raspberry leaf, sex, and walking. So those are the ones that I've personally looked at the research on. And I think the evidence is, comes on a spectrum. Like some of these are more supported by evidence than others. For example, there's pretty strong evidence that nipple stimulation can stimulate labor in someone who has a ripe cervix. So, and I know you've talked about labor induction before in your podcast. With labor induction, there's a difference between cervical ripening, which is kind of that first step where your cervix is getting ready to be able to dilate. And then there's the actual labor contraction. So some of these methods, they may help with cervical ripening. Some of them may help with contractions, and some of them don't really help either. Also, you have some methods that maybe the research shows are not effective, but they could have a placebo effect. The placebo effect is real. There's fascinating research on the placebo effect, how you can give somebody a tiny pill and maybe all it has is like a tiny amount of sugar or glucose, but it can actually change how you feel, symptoms that you have if you believe it is a treatment. So some of these methods, people may say, oh, I ate pineapple and I went into labor that night. Well, I don't doubt that you went into labor that night, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the pineapple did it. It might have been your body was ready to go into labor that night and it just did. It might have been a coincidence, or it could have been that, there was a placebo effect where you finally relaxed because you were like, this will work. And then your body went into labor. So things like pineapple, we actually have an animated video on our YouTube channel kind of explaining the research, because a lot of these methods may not have a lot of research to back them up, but there's a long ancestral tradition of different cultures using these methods. Like pineapple fruit has been used traditionally around the world for a variety of female reproductive issues, ranging from abortion all the way to inducing labor. And just because we don't have research on something doesn't mean it's not effective. So there's very little research on that. But that doesn't mean it might not work. I mean, it could. We just don't have a lot of research on its effectiveness. And that goes back to, I said earlier, there's bias in how research is carried out. There's bias in who gets funded and what kinds of interventions get studied. So one of the things they try to do in as many studies as possible, it's called double-blind placebo-controlled trial. And some people call it double-masked. But what that means is both parties don't know which treatment you're getting. So the birthing person does not know what treatment they've been given, and their care provider does not know what treatment has been given. The only person that knows is, it was written down in like a secret file that will only be revealed after the study is over and all the data has been analyzed. That allows you to control for that placebo effect, because then nobody knows exactly who got the actual treatment. And the thing is, you can do that with some natural treatments. For example, evening primrose oil, theoretically, you could give someone actual evening primrose oil in a capsule, and you can give somebody else an identical tasting, smelling, looking capsule, and nobody knows who's received what, except it was written down and will be revealed later. And that lets you understand, was it a placebo effect or not? Because if you told one group, here, you're getting the placebo, and yes, you're getting the actual treatment, that messes with your brain a little bit and can affect which symptoms you have.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's other things that are harder to mask. For example, I don't think you could blind someone to whether or not they've eaten pineapple,
right,
or whether or not they've had sex. These are the kinds of things that blinding is impossible. So you're never going to have a study that truly proves, one way or the other. But you can have research like suggesting different effects. And the one interesting thing that you can do is a sham treatment. So it's a little bit different than a true placebo. But for example, acupuncture has been used for more than 2,000 years in China and Japan. It has a long tradition of being used in traditional Chinese medicine. And so with acupuncture, when tiny needles are inserted into specific acupuncture points that the doctor or the practitioner has decided you needed help with, they can actually do a fake acupuncture treatment. It's called sham acupuncture, where they'll use the needles, but they'll put them in points that are not acupuncture points. And unless you know all the points, you will have no idea if you're getting the true acupuncture or the sham acupuncture. So there are some ways you can try and control for that placebo effect with things like that you would think you could not mask or blind.
So interesting. Well, let's talk about, you've named off a bunch of them. Let's talk about some of the differences between those that might possibly put you into labor, okay, versus ones that can encourage spontaneous labor over time, like maybe prepping your cervix or something else. I know red raspberry leaf tea is one of them. It's supposed to help your uterine muscle, if I'm not mistaken. You obviously know more than me, but I know that's a big difference in a lot of these, is that some of them are more going to help with your cervical ripeness versus actually putting you into labor.
So if somebody's listening to this and they're like, all right, how do I use natural induction methods to put me into labor? Like I said earlier, you have that cervical ripening where your cervix is soft and thin and prepared to dilate. And some methods are helpful for that. And then once the cervix is favorable, you can stimulate those uterine contractions artificially or, with medications or herbs or whatever it is you're using. And with people who are trying natural induction methods, I hesitate to say that you can truly induce labor. With most of these, you can't, because you can't create hormones out of nothing if your body is not already ready to go into labor. This is why preterm inductions are so difficult. I don't know if any of your listeners have ever, or if you as a labor nurse have ever seen someone where they're trying to induce you early because of preeclampsia or some other, urgent medical concern. But it's very, very difficult to get contractions started early. Is that something you've had experience with, Lisa?
Oh, yeah, totally. And especially when they're on magnesium. And the magnesium is like reversing the contraction agent too. It's so hard when you have a prime mom who hasn't had a baby at all before and they're preterm and you need to induce them for this, that, and the other. Now, sometimes they have advanced preeclampsia and their body's already like, we need to get this baby out. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like once we prep their cervix and we get some contractions going, like they do end up delivering fast. Like I feel like we see that all the time, but it's that cervical prep that takes so long sometimes. It's just
if
like
the cervix is not ripened.
Right.
Exactly. And so, the same thing is true with the natural induction methods. If your cervix is not ripe at all, it's unlikely that a lot of these methods will start contractions. A lot of them, you kind of have to have already had a ripened cervix before they might trigger labor, or these methods might be helpful for ripening your cervix. So another thing that I think a lot of people don't understand is the hormones and the receptors. So oxytocin, which artificially is Pitocin, it can't cause contractions unless the receptor that catches that oxytocin is present, is popped out on the lining of the uterus. So there are these tiny, invisible little receptors that pop out, and the oxytocin is floating around in your bloodstream, and it catches the oxytocin, which then can help trigger a contraction. So if your receptors have not popped up, you can give somebody Pitocin all day long and nothing will happen because there's nothing for the oxytocin to latch onto. So, but that's where I think natural induction methods can be helpful, especially as if you're preparing for a medical induction or you're worried you might need one. Some people like to go ahead and try some of these methods to ripen their cervix so that when they start the induction, it might go a little bit smoother.
Yeah, I talk about that a lot in the birth courses, how it's the goal of doing these things, or, if you're going to try them is not, don't think that if you just eat this pineapple, you're going to go into labor. Like, think that the goal is to prep your body so that when your body is ready to go into labor, whether you get induced or not, it's able to do it a little bit smoother. Whether you're due in a few days or a few months, I'm guessing you'd love to feel a little more in control of your birth experience. This is why I'm so pumped to tell you about my brand new, totally free birth prep guide. It's got over 40 pages of info and resources to help you erase the unknowns and gain that sense of control that you deserve. There's hospital bag lists and birth plans, third trimester to-dos and freezer stocking recipes, tons of info about epidurals, unmedicated birth and C-sections, guided meditation tracks, and so much more. Here to help you prepare for birth, no matter how you plan to deliver, head on over to mommylabornurse.com/birthprep to grab it now, or simply click on the link in the description of this week's episode. That's mommylabornurse.com/birthprep to access the free birth prep guide today. So, and that I think eases a lot of people's minds, because I think when we're pregnant, we're like, okay, I'm just going to do these things and nothing's working. I'm having contractions, but it's like, no, these things are probably working. They're prepping your cervix, but your body's just not ready to go into labor yet. It's like just adjusting your expectations per se.
Right, exactly. But then once your cervix is ripened, there are some things that can trigger labor contractions. Castor oil is one. This is an ancient treatment. It dates back to ancient Egypt, the use of this to induce labor. But it's really only effective if you're already kind of ready to go into labor. So it's probably not going to work if you're preterm, if it's your first baby and your cervix is completely closed and thick and not ripened at all. So there are certain things that, like I said earlier, you can't make something out of nothing. So if your body is totally not ready, you could eat all the pineapple you want, and the only thing you have to worry about is getting a sore mouth, which has happened to me because I love pineapple.
I know, me too. I know. Oh, yeah. And I know that feeling very well. You get it real sore in your mouth. Oh, okay. Well, let's dive into some of these that you've listed off. Let's start with red raspberry leaf tea and its role in spontaneous labor. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about the potential benefits, effectiveness of this based on the available evidence that you have?
Sure. So red raspberry leaf is native to at least Europe, North America, and Asia. And it's been used for more than 1,400 years to create medicinal and herbal tea. So it's a very ancient treatment, and it can be taken as a tablet or a tea. And often you'll hear people recommend taking it to like tone your uterus to get it ready to go into labor. Or maybe they think if you take this, it'll shorten the length of your labor, or maybe make you go into labor quicker. And so it's generally recognized as safe to take red raspberry leaf, but there's really not, and it has this long traditional history, but there's not research. And as I said at the beginning, just because you don't have research doesn't mean it's not effective. It just means we don't have research. So since I'm from evidence-based birth, I can't tell you, yes, it works, or no, it doesn't work, unless I can have some evidence for you. There's one double-blind randomized trial on red raspberry leaf during labor where they assigned 192 low-risk first-time mothers to either take the tablets or an identical-looking placebo tablet starting at 32 weeks until they went into labor. And unfortunately, they found zero differences between the groups. There's no differences in the length of pregnancy, the number of people who needed a medical labor induction, or the length of their labor. So that's the only study on humans that we have. There have been some laboratory studies where they're like examining raspberry leaf and exposing uterine tissue in a petri dish to red raspberry leaf, and they've come up mixed. So some of the studies find, it does make the uterus tissue contract, and other researchers are it makes the uterine tissue relax. So it's not effective. And so we don't really have evidence supporting it, but if you like red raspberry leaf tea, it is caffeine free. It is rich in vitamins and minerals, and it tastes good. So there's really, very little research for pros or cons. And like I said, there's conflicting results in the laboratory studies. So, enjoy your red raspberry leaf tea. And maybe if you believe it will work, that placebo effect might work, but it's not been shown yet, even to labor or ripen your cervix.
Yeah. And I also say to any of these, if you hate red raspberry leaf tea, even if it is the most effective thing in the world, don't make yourself choke it down just because you're desperate, to go into labor. Like if you hate pineapple, don't make yourself eat a whole darn pineapple.
Yeah. So unfortunately, I remember when I first published this research, people got really mad at me because they were like, it works. I tell all my clients to use it. And I'm like, it might. I don't have the research yet. Maybe someday we'll have research on it. And I do believe that it's also important to acknowledge and respect like herbal and medicinal treatments that have been used for centuries. And there's a reason they probably used it. So
right. Exactly.
It's another type of evidence that often is not considered.
Right. Well said. Well, let's move on to something called the Miles circuit. I've talked about this quite a bit on the podcast, and it's definitely gaining popularity recently as a natural technique to help with spontaneous labor. So could you explain kind of what it is, what it involves, share any evidence at all, if there is any out there to support its effectiveness?
Sure. So the Miles circuit is a tool that a lot of doulas and midwives recommend to help get the baby lined up in a more optimal position for you to go into labor. And I believe you can just go to milescircuit.com or Google it and you'll find the website. And it shows you, it's basically like an exercise circuit, but a specific pattern of movements, walking, and other like exercise type movements that help open up your pelvis and make more room for the baby to get into an optimal position. And I guess my understanding of that, there is a reflex that our bodies have that when the baby's head is pressing right on the cervix, it helps ripen the cervix. So it creates a feedback loop, especially during labor. So if your baby's head is not in an optimal position, so maybe your baby's posterior and you're not, in that case, the baby's head cannot sit right on top of the cervix, or maybe it sits unevenly. And when you don't have that feedback loop of the pressure from the baby's head, the cervix isn't going to ripen. So my understanding is that using the Miles circuit helps create room and movement for the baby to get into a better position, and then their head can kind of put pressure on the cervix more evenly. And that's my understanding. So I don't think it will start labor in somebody who's not ready. That doesn't really make sense. But if all your body needs is for that baby to be in a better position, I can see how, like, theoretically it might work. As far as I know, there's no research on the Miles circuit. This is just, again, another tool that has been passed down through the midwifery community and the doula community. But I do have research on walking, which, it's different. It's a more simple form. But, walking is one of those things that everybody tries to do to start labor. It's super common. And so I was really curious if walking by itself starts labor. And I found a study. There's actually been a randomized controlled trial of walking that was done in 2020. And they assigned 131 pregnant women who were pregnant with a single baby in head first position. They had no prior cesarean. And they randomly assigned them to walk on a treadmill 30 minutes 3 times a week at a moderate intensity. And on average, they did about 5 walking sessions, because they started at 38 weeks. And the control group did not do any kind of exercise routine. And they found that the walking group was less likely to need an induction, 18% versus 33%. And they had fewer births with forceps or vacuum, 21% versus 38%. And there were no other differences. And so it's considered safe to walk during pregnancy. I assume the Miles circuit is, it looks like yoga positions and that sort of thing. So it doesn't seem like it could be risky. And we have that one trial showing that movement helps.
Right.
So I think, again, it's one of those things where, a lot of doulas and midwives have seen it work. We don't have official research on it, but we do know that movement and walking can help lower your risk of needing an induction. So, and also physiologically, it makes sense that if you're helping the baby get in a better position, your body's in a better place to start labor.
Yeah, makes total sense. I did it before my second one. And again, I was 40 and a half weeks pregnant, and I had been contracting kind of on and off all day, and I did the mile circuit, and I went into labor a few hours later. So it's like, that's really when I've seen it work best, is when people are having prodromal labor, or I've done it with people in labor who maybe have a stalled labor. And again, it's just kind of shifting the baby into that more optimal position. And that makes sense why it would work. So
yeah. And I just saw that SharonMusa.com has a really nice website describing the mile circuit with pictures and a handout that you can download, like, to help guide you through it. So it seems to me, like you said, I've heard that as well, that prodromal labor can be a sign of less than optimal positioning of the baby. The baby just has not gotten in the right spot to put that full pressure on the cervix and create the cervical ripening and contractions that you really need. And the body knows that. Like, that's probably the purpose of prodromal contractions, is to get you to walk around and move around and shift and change positions. But unfortunately, sometimes it can go on forever and be really exhausting as well.
Yes, not fun. Definitely not fun to be in prodromal labor. Well, let's move on to nipple stimulation. So this is a natural method believed to trigger contractions. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the only ones really backed by research in terms of like, okay, this is something like the castor oil that you've said. Castor oil is a little bit different, I guess, but it's really backed in solid research. So can you talk a little bit more about nipple stimulation?
Yeah. So nipple stimulation, when you're feeding your baby as well, or if you do it before labor, it causes the release of oxytocin from the pituitary gland in your brain. So it has a feedback loop that increases uterine contractions. And it's been used for about 1,400 years, as far as we know. Like, that's when the first written documentation was used. It's been used in pretty much every culture. So again, this method has a long ancestral tradition being used. And we do have research on it showing that it can be effective. There have been 6 randomized trials where people were randomly assigned to receive nipple stimulation versus nothing, or just Pitocin. And in every study, I think it's important to note that when people do the self breast or nipple stimulation, you're only stimulating one side at a time. So you don't want to stimulate both nipples, because that could release too much oxytocin. And so here's a sample stimulation protocol. So in 2 of the studies, they did it 1 hour a day for 3 days, alternating sides every 15 minutes. And in other trials, they did it for 3 hours a day, where you do an hour, take a break, do another hour, take a break, etc. And you're alternating again every 10 to 15 minutes. And in one study, they did it with a breast pump, which I think is another popular way these days to do breast stimulation, for about 1 hour. And again, you would alternate sides. So you'd only do one side at a time and you switch sides. And in the research, they found that more people who use nipple stimulation will go into labor over the next 3 days, but it's not super high. It's like 37% will go into labor versus 6% of the control group. But the important thing to know is this did not happen in those who had an unripened cervix. So this is another one where ripening the cervix is important. You can't make something out of nothing. If the cervix is unripe, it can't start dilating with contractions. So there was another study that found doing it 3 times a day, starting at 38 weeks, led to a higher Bishop's score when you went to the hospital, and fewer cesareans as well, and birthing 3 days earlier on average. So it can be used to ripen the cervix. And if your cervix is ripened, then it can be used to induce labor. And so it is thought to increase the chances that you'll go into labor, but it's not a guaranteed method. And one of the benefits of nipple stimulation is it's free. You know, you can do it yourself and have control over it. But the disadvantage is it's not guaranteed to work. Also, there's no research on doing this in high-risk pregnancies. And almost all of the studies, this was done with monitoring. So because it can cause strong contractions, there have been case reports where people have overstimulated their uterus. And so if there's any health concerns, it's one of those things where you would definitely want to talk with your provider about it before you start. Because it's just, something to keep in mind. Make sure that you're in a good situation to start doing, and that you make sure that they're recommending it and that they are aware that you're doing it, so that if you do go into labor, they can know to expect you.
Yeah, totally. All right, the sound of that heartbeat means it's time for this week's segment of Birth It Up Babies. This one says, "Hi, Liesl. I just wanted to stop by and say that on 6/21, my husband and I welcomed our first baby, and our experience couldn't have gone better. A lot thanks to your course. Oh, we took the epidural series, and it had so much amazing info in it. I love that I was able to watch it with my husband on our own time, because then he knew exactly the same info as me. Going into pregnancy, my biggest fears were the unknown of how I'd respond to pain and the fear of dying during childbirth, both very, very real and very common fears that people have, for sure. I used a lot of different tips and tricks from your course and Instagram page that I kept in a note on my phone over the last 2 years to prepare. All. During labor before my epidural, I had that note and your Birth It Up epidural series pulled up and would just look through them through contractions for different things to try. The course also taught me that I did have specific preferences for my birth and baby, and I'm happy to share that I got 95% of everything I listed on my birth plan. That is so great. So great. Amazing. Thank you for all you do to educate us." Oh, I love it. I love that she talked about how she had the course up during her birth experience too, because that's something I think that a lot of people don't realize that they can do. Like, because it's online, you can just, as long as you have the internet connection, you can access it on your phone or on your iPad or whatever, and you can watch it while you're in labor. Yeah, just pull it up. It's a really, really great feature of having online courses. So if you want to have an even better birth, just like this mama, head on over to mommylabornurse.com/courses to learn more about our 3 online on-demand birth classes. Well, that kind of goes into the next question that I wanted to discuss about the safety aspects of really any natural induction method, not even just nipple stimulation, but any of these. Can you discuss some of the potential risks or contraindications related to using some of these techniques? And I mean, you already said one of them, like if you've had a high-risk pregnancy, obviously you want to talk to your provider about any of these, right? Regardless if you've had a high-risk pregnancy or not. But when, it might be best to avoid some of these. Or all of these.
Yeah. So each one is unique, right? Each method has unique disadvantages. For example, with acupuncture, there's some minor adverse effects that can happen with acupuncture, and we don't really have large studies to look at rare side effects. So it's possible that there could be, with any of these, there could be a rare side effect that we don't anticipate. And we don't know because the studies aren't big enough. Because with rare things, they happen rarely. So you have to have large studies to see them. With nipple stimulation, I mentioned the uterine contractions getting too close together and too strong is a possibility. Hopefully that could be reversed by just stopping the nipple stimulation. Castor oil has a lot of really well-known side effects, including nausea and diarrhea. But the nausea can be reduced by blending it into a cold smoothie. And a lot of midwives have special formulations they recommend their clients use to take the castor oil. Because I don't know if you've ever opened a bottle of castor oil and tried to convince yourself to swallow some.
That's stinky. Don't want to really
and it's this weird oily, because it's an oil. So I almost took it once, but I could not convince myself to swallow it. Especially in pregnancy, you're hypersensitive to smells and tastes.
Your gag reflexes. I can't. I know.
But just go on Google and you can find some really interesting castor oil smoothie recipes that use champagne or ice cream or whatever, and they make it tolerable. There's some things like eating dates and eating pineapple. Like if you have diabetes or gestational diabetes, you might not be able to eat that. It might raise your blood sugar. And I think the main one with concerns from the research are some of the herbal treatments. So I always encourage anyone, if you're interested in using herbal supplements to induce labor, it's really important to let both your care provider know, but also talk with a qualified herbalist, because the use of herbs has an ancient history. Most of our evidence is based on just traditional anecdotes or wisdom. which is great, but we don't have a lot of info about how some of these may work on people today during current times. And there are 2 herbs in particular that have a long history of use to induce labor, but they're currently not recommended to use during pregnancy. And those are blue cohosh and black cohosh. And while they do have some properties that may release oxytocin, they can be dangerous. They can have toxic effects on the fetus, toxic effects on your heart. And because of those potentially toxic effects, researchers recommend that it would be prudent to avoid black or blue cohosh during pregnancy. Now, I know some midwives would disagree with me, but that's just what I've read from reading the research. And again, having a qualified herbalist with you can be helpful. There are other herbs, though, that are not, considered to be as high risk as the cohosh is, because there's also chamomile and saffron and some of those like that. So I recommend talking with an herbalist and just making sure you know what you're doing when you're taking some of those herbs to induce labor.
Yeah, makes sense. Well, are there any specific factors that might influence maybe the success rate of some of these induction methods? Like if you're we talked a little bit about, if you're preterm, your cervix isn't ready, your gestational age, for example, or your medical history. Do those, I know you're going to say yes, but do those play a role in how maybe effective that they might be?
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting things to me is whether or not it's your first baby.
Yeah.
For example, castor oil can stimulate the uterus, but if it's your first labor, it's really going to be way less effective.
Yeah.
And unless you're past your due date and you already have a ripened cervix and that sort of thing. And that, unfortunately, is the case with a lot of the methods. Sometimes you'll find that with the first baby, they might be less likely to work. Otherwise, each of the individual methods, I guess, could have some strategies that maybe, like, for example, having sex is a popular way to try and induce labor. And there are different things during sexual intercourse that can increase or decrease the chances that it might trigger labor. For example, if you have an orgasm, if your cervix is exposed to semen, which has prostaglandins in semen, if there's nipple stimulation, those kinds of things can increase the chances that it might be successful as opposed to not having those things.
Makes sense. All right. So for women who are considering trying some of these natural induction methods, because we have pregnant people who listen to this podcast who are all gestational ages, but I would say a large majority of them are on the cusp. They're looking to go into labor. What should they specifically discuss with their healthcare provider beforehand to make sure that these things are safe for them? Because we said that from the beginning, that is something that you must do.
Well, sadly, I would say most medical providers educated in medical schools and residency programs are going to have very little to no information or education on this. So we can say talk with your healthcare provider to ascertain safety, but to be honest, they don't know.
Yeah.
Because this is not something that they study. It's not something that's taught in their residency programs. And a lot of this is knowledge and wisdom that has been held by the midwifery tradition, which has not always received the respect that it deserves. So I would say,
good point. Yeah.
If you have a midwife, you could probably talk with them about any of these methods, and they may have insights, suggestions, recommendations, info about safety or effectiveness. If you bring it up with a doctor, there's very few doctors. I would say a small minority would actually have been educated on this. But at the same time, I think we need to be open with our healthcare providers about what we're choosing to ingest and use during pregnancy. I don't think, for example, you need to tell your healthcare provider you're going to have sex to try and go into labor.
Yeah.
Or that you're going to go on a walk to induce labor, eat some pineapple. But if you're going to be taking herbal methods, other like traditional medicinal methods, or if you're trying nipple stimulation, talk with your healthcare provider. Just know that they might not have a lot of knowledge about.
A lot to say.
Or it might make them nervous, or maybe they'll be like, well, I don't know if that's going to work. They might discourage you. But unless they have actual evidence to share with you, then I would take what they say with a grain of salt. It's hard because you want to build a trusting relationship with your provider. And I don't want to say don't listen to them, but you also have to understand the cultural divide between the midwifery model of care and the medical model of care. And if you're more someone who leans towards natural methods, but you're paired up with a provider who leans very heavily on the medical side, you might have a little bit of tension there.
Yeah.
And if you feel like you can't talk openly with your provider about different things you want to try to start labor, that to me is a red flag that they're not in alignment with your wishes. And if you have time, you can switch. But if you're finding this podcast and it's too late, just do your best to gather as much information as you can. You can bring it with you to appointments. At EBB. We do have a pocket guide to labor induction that we publish that has all the evidence on the different reasons providers might suggest inducing labor. And then we have all the evidence on the medical methods and all the evidence on the natural methods. So if you want something that can help bridge the divide, sometimes sharing that evidence with the providers can be helpful. I don't know if you have any other suggestions, Liesl, about kind of facilitating discussion when you have that gap between the pregnant person and the provider.
Yeah, I mean, I second everything you just said, and I'm glad that you mentioned switching providers too, because that is definitely a red flag. If you are considering some of these things and your provider's not even willing to have a discussion, that's definitely a red flag. And you maybe even at 40 weeks pregnant, it's going to be a little hard to switch providers, but you always have choices. Remember that.
Yeah, and you can always get a second opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe you don't want to switch providers.
Right.
But maybe you could consult somebody else too. Also, I think it's sad that these are not offered. Because to be honest, if you're preparing for medical induction for whatever reason, I think providers should be educating their clients on here are some acupressure points you can use to help ripen your cervix, or you could start doing nipple stimulation and give you the instructions, or, go ahead and start eating dates in the week leading up to your induction. There's things that people have found helpful throughout history and might make your induction go smoother if you come in and your cervix is already ripe,
Absolutely.
But this is not typically offered. It's medical methods or nothing. Yeah. And I think we can actually combine. You can use the natural methods to help prepare you for a medical induction.
Yep.
And there's no reason you can't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, one more question, and then we'll kind of wrap up. We already talked about the cohoshes and how those aren't super safe, but any other induction methods that you've seen or done, there's been research on that are 100%, hey, or not 100%, but hey, probably not a good idea. Let's not do this one.
I don't know. Are there any you're thinking of?
I can't think of any, but I mean, I was going to say the cohoshes. I know you mentioned those. And I was going to say, hey, obviously, if you have a certain medical condition, if you have a previa, probably not a good idea to be trying to do any of these, right? To induce labor because you have a previa or
if you have, yeah, that's what they call a contraindication. If there's a reason why you should not have a vaginal birth or go into labor right now, then don't do these things.
Turn off the podcast, okay? No, I'm just kidding.
But to be honest, I would say a lot of what I said earlier, this research is on low risk. Yeah. If you're high risk, this info may not apply to you. So, but again, there are some things that are generally thought of to be extremely safe, like movement and walking. For most people, unless your waters have broken, sex is considered safe in pregnancy. Drinking red raspberry leaf tea, there's not been any documented, bad cases or outcomes from that. So a lot of these things, they might not help, but these more gentler methods probably won't hurt either. Yep. So, do whatever feels right to you and take care of yourself. Because I know it can be stressful.
Yes.
And another option is just to not do any of these things.
Yeah, and that's okay too. Right.
Exactly. Because I don't talk about this very often, but I went past 42 weeks with my last baby.
Oh.
And I'm looking at these things. That's the time I told you I looked at the castor oil.
Yeah.
But could not swallow it. To be honest, I did. I think I ate pineapple the day I went to labor. I don't think that was the cause. I mean, I think the cause I went into labor was because I was 42 weeks and 3 days.
Yeah.
So it was going to happen eventually. Anyways, now that I have this info, like maybe I would have tried a castor oil smoothie, or I would have been eating dates. And I didn't even know about acupressure back then. So that's one reason we added it to the evidence-based birth childbirth class, because I think the research on acupressure is really encouraging, and it's something you can do yourself. And for the most part, it's a gentle, easy way to ripen your cervix. Or maybe I should have done nipple stimulation. I don't know. I think mine was more of a psychological or mental block to going into labor. For me, I think I reached my due date right before the Christmas holidays, and we had a bunch of family coming into town, and I was really reluctant to have a baby with my whole extended family.
I see.
Just because there's not that I don't love my family, but I'm a very private person. And so I think I was mentally holding back. And I will tell you, I went into labor. My last sibling left town, and I went into labor like 3 hours later.
Isn't that funny how that happens? So, Rebecca, I feel like I hear that all the darn time. It's like I was, in the moving truck and just got, it's like your body knows. It releases something. Yes.
Yeah. And so I also encourage people who take our class, but anybody listening, if you feel like you've reached the point where it's safe to go into labor and you feel like you're ready, doing some kind of fear release.
Yeah.
And I know HypnoBabies has some different like self-hypnosis tracks that I used. And we also recorded a fear release audio for our childbirth class participants, but just kind of letting go of the pressure and trying to reassure yourself that whatever it is you're anxious about, you are safe, your baby is safe. And whether or not it works, I think it's still helpful. And I think I did that twice. So I did one fear release, then I did another good one. And then everybody left and I felt safe.
Really what you needed. Yeah.
Often we can't go into labor unless we feel safe and protected and at peace. And so that's a way that we're protecting our baby. We don't want them to be born into a stressful environment. So whatever you can do to find that peace. And I know a lot of people, they go into labor right after they get that last thing done that they wanted to do.
Yeah. Yep.
So I think, we don't have research on that. But again, this is like traditional wisdom. And I think a lot of moms and parents know that feeling of release when you finally are ready for the baby to arrive.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. It just made me think, as you were talking about your family, that my second one, I did a similar thing right before I went into labor with him. I went off of social media. I deleted Instagram because I'm like, I just need to not be distracted with anything. And I was like anxious about getting enough stuff done for like my maternity leave that I was on. So I'm like, I'm just going to go off. Nobody, I can't see any messages come through. I can't see any posts. I can't see anything. And lo and behold, I went into labor.
I love that, Liesl. I love that. Yeah, taking a social media break, unplugging, doing what feels right to you. And one thing I did is, have you ever heard of the joke where you tell people to go, have you had that baby yet.com?
Yes, I have.
Okay. Yes. Well, I think I just texted everybody and said,
Yeah.
And because there is that pressure to consider from family and friends of that just hovering over your shoulder, waiting for you. And some people are not sensitive to that, but I am. So it bothered me.
Sure am too. Yeah. I gotcha. Oh, I love it. Well, Rebecca, thank you so much. This was fabulous. Such an informative episode. I know this one's going to be a popular one. Where can people find you on social media, your website? Give us all your links and all your things.
Sure. You can go to evidencebasedbirth.com or just Google evidence-based birth and you'll find all of our articles. You can look for our podcasts on any podcast listener, and on Instagram, we're at EBBirth. And we also have a lot of YouTubes on YouTube at evidence-based birth. And again, we have a childbirth class. We have pocket guides to comfort measures, to labor induction, and to intervention. So that is sometimes something that parents like to have to take with them to the hospital.
Love it. Love it. Oh, thank you so much. So much. This was fabulous. I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, Liesl.
Already feeling a little more confident about pregnancy, birth, and newborn life? Don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you can continue to erase the unknowns and never miss an episode. And if you're looking for even more, Instagram is definitely where I hang out the most. Come join our community of more than 500,000 moms for birth education, tips, and solidarity. You can find me at mommy.labornurse. Check out today's show notes and a searchable library of every Mommy Labor Nurse podcast episode at mommylabornurse.com/podcast. And while you're there, be sure to head to the blog to learn about our online birth classes too. See you next week. And remember, you can have an even better birth no matter how you deliver.